Now I want to talk about causes and consequences of abusing substances. And on the two slides or three slides that follow this one, we're also going to be talking about different risk factors for abusing substances as well. But to start with, I want to take a developmental perspective, as I already have when we started to talk about this lecture, that when we see problematic behavior in adolescence, often it has earlier developmental roots. And it's not necessarily a problem just of adolescence as a whole. So this is just one pathway here that you can see with these four boxes of how substance use can develop and turn into an abuse problem. So at age 7, this is arbitrary. This is just one example. It could be the case that we have an individual who doesn't really get along with other kids, perhaps some antisocial behaviors, also doesn't show concern for moral issues, so doesn't have a normal guilt response. Somebody who maybe has some cognitive deficits, so like here it says not planful, person that you can't really trust. So we already see some poor adjustment issues. What are the causes of these behaviors? That can vary quite substantially from person to person as well. So at age 11, so we were still in adolescence, but very early adolescence, we might see this individual engaged in some deviant behavior. So trying to set fires or getting into fights. We see some issues with emotions, not being able to control negative emotions, for example. Still some cognitive problems with inattention. And then when we get to later on in adolescence, we can see how all of these things are leading to problematic behavior in all areas of life. And through all of this, we can say that they're starting to engage in more problematic behaviors because it has more of an impact on society at large. And then what happens into adulthood? We know that there are associations between substance abuse and issues with jobs, relationships, and health overall. So it's a series of behaviors and a series of personality traits that are coming together and interacting with substance use, which then becomes substance abuse, that are leading to a problematic life broadly. So if we see an adolescent who's engaging in some of these behaviors, and if we're interested in helping them seek treatment, we have to understand the earlier developmental roots in order to prevent the long-term outcomes. So based on the research, there tends to be 4 sets of risk factors for developing a substance abuse problem. I'm going to talk about each of these one after the other. First, psychological, then family issues, social, and contextual. The way that these risk factors typically work is the more that you have, the more you have a chance of having an abuse problem. This is called an additive model. The research generally shows that these risk factors are the same for everyone. These are universal risk factors. So regardless of one's socioeconomic status, ethnicity, sex, and so on, the more that you have of these risk factors, the more likely it is that a substance abuse problem can occur. These aren't specific just to adolescence, but certainly this is starting in adolescence and perhaps even earlier, as we were talking about with the developmental model. Let's first talk about psychological risk factors. Psychological risk factors, there's multiple facets or multiple factors. The first involves personality traits. There are some individuals who are more anger prone, more impulsive, have some issues with inattention, and are higher in sensation seeking. Sensation seeking is a individual difference in which we've talked about this before, but some people are risk takers and wanting to feel that adrenaline, and other people are less likely to want to do those things, so lower in sensation seeking. It's not to say that every individual has all of these personality traits, although sometimes these traits are correlated with one another. So individuals who have impulsivity issues sometimes also have inattentiveness. We think about somebody with ADHD, for example. These psychological traits can be genetic. As we've talked about, some of these personality traits have roots in temperament, which is a biological, biological individual differences. But environment certainly matters too. Environment matters in terms of how well we can control our individual differences, but also provides a context for which we're in that helps us decide to not use or to use. Psychologically, we can also talk about attitudes, not just about ourselves, but of other people around us. So if we have more tolerant ideas and attitudes about drug use, this is a potential risk factor. If we think that drug use isn't going to be problematic or lead to negative outcomes, then we're more likely to use. So essentially, the psychological constructs here of personality traits and attitudes are just two of the factors that could lead us to go down the road of developing a substance abuse problem. There also are other family factors that could become risk factors for substance abuse. So, for example, if family relationships are really distant or hostile, we've already talked about how these can be problematic for development broadly in childhood. But similarly, that's going to, be the same case in adolescence as well. If we have parents who are excessively permissive, we already talked about how there's a link between permissive parenting and some deviant behavior in adolescence. Or if you have parents who are neglectful or rejecting parents, these are parents who aren't necessarily watching over their children or adolescents, and children or adolescents are left to make decisions for themselves without consequences, or at least not consequences in the moment. Similarly, if you have family members who are smokers or drinkers or who are doing drugs, this is also a risk factor, and for multiple reasons. One, they could also have a genetic predisposition to have an abuse problem, which you may also have. But it's also environmental because essentially they're setting it up where there are more tolerant attitudes, or substances are more present, so you can use their substances. So there's both a genetic and environmental component to that. A social factor is something that we've already been talking about too, because these are interconnected. And the idea here is that if you have friends who use and tolerate the use of drugs, this means it's more likely that you're going to adopt these attitudes and values as well. It also makes it the case where, just like with parents and other family members, where these substances are more likely to just be around. And another thing that we haven't really talked about is that if we see our peers and friends using and or abusing drugs or alcohol, we start to think that everyone does drugs or everyone drinks. And so when we see the people that matter to us or that are close to us using it, we start to think that this is very common. And what we see in adolescence, this isn't just adolescence, this applies to adults too, but it goes along the lines of like, well, if all of these other adolescents are doing this, then I probably should too, because I'm an adolescent. I want to just be normal. Essentially what we're doing is we're overestimating how common substance use actually is. So if it's more prevalent among our peers and our friends, then we decide maybe that I want to do it too because everybody else is doing it. I want to reiterate that this isn't just an adolescent phenomenon. This would also be something that would apply to adults as well. The last big risk factor is just context. And it's, again, not that we haven't been talking about this in relation to the other risk factors, but it is its own separate risk factor. Broadly, we're looking at how easy and available are drugs, how easy are they to get, and this is going to be different from place to place and from person to person. Similarly, what are the community's norms? Like, is this something that is taboo? Is this something that is praised? What is it like? And also, are drug laws enforced? We can talk about community very broadly. Is this the high school? Is the high school busting people? Is the high school, do they have strict rules about drug use, or is it something that kind of is just brushed under the rug. Interestingly enough, though, I want to talk that this isn't just a socioeconomic status thing. You can imagine that there are big differences between wealthy communities and impoverished areas, and they both could have drug use issues. So, for example, in a wealthier area, we do know there's research on this, including some of these like wealthy high schools, let's say in the Chicago area, where drug use, particularly prescription drug use, is really common. Now, in those areas, it may be the case, and I'm not speaking for everyone, of course, but it may be the case that it's easy to get prescription drugs because, you look like a professional or clean-cut person, and drug laws aren't really enforced. It's not the case that a police officer is going to be doing, drive-by, they're going to be watching you in your picket fence neighborhood. That's not necessarily the case. So drug laws aren't as likely to be enforced. Similarly, in more of an impoverished area, it may be the case that there might be more crime, and police officers have to choose which kind of crime they're tackling. So in both of those situations, drug laws might be less likely to be enforced, meaning that drug use can become more rampant. So it's for one of those reasons that, as I said before, these risk factors apply for everyone because our contexts just differ, but they differ in ways that could both lead to substance abuse issues. Just a reminder that these issues are additive. So the more of these risk factors that you have, the more likely it is to be the case that a substance abuse problem could occur in adolescence and in adulthood.